Hey everybody, welcome back. My name is Scott Newhouse. I am so glad that you and the dozens and dozens of other listeners are back on this show. Today I want to talk about just some advice and some things to keep in mind if you're looking to buy a home. We have had a crazy 5-year run with the housing market. Things I think are changing. I've got a little bit of evidence that I want to kind of share with all of you. And so this is kind of an episode for if you're looking to buy a home, just keep these things in mind so that you're more informed than you would be without having watched this episode. So let's go through every point that I've got here. First of all, interest rates are at a 15-year high. And so we probably know that, from after the Great Recession, 2010, 2011, we had historically low interest rates, 3 to 4% on a 30-year fixed mortgage, which is absolutely incredible. Around 2022, 2023, jumped back up to 6%. Now it's at 7%. And historically, interest rates have been around this high, 6, 7, 8%. And that's the way it was pre-Great Recession in the mid-2000s. And that's the way it was in the 90s. And in the 80s, it was actually even higher than that. So the historical anomaly is the 3 to 4% fixed mortgage rate, whereas the 6 to 7 to 8%, that's more of the historical average. So you just got to keep that in mind. I hope, for the sake of home buyers, we get back to 3 to 4%, but that hasn't been the case yet. There's the old adage, marry the house, date the rate. I'm not positive. And maybe a realtor is going to tell you that in hopes of trying to get you to buy a home. I'm just really not sure when we're going to get back down to those low levels. So I think if you do want to buy a home, you've really got to mentally and financially be prepared for 6 to 7% interest rates and not thinking, just in a couple years, we're going to go back to 3%, because that's not the historical norm. So just keep that in mind. My second point is I just want to, or actually this goes along with the first point, but just take a look at the difference of these interest rates have on an average home. So the average home in the U.S. sales price is around $416,000. Let's look at the payment on a 7% interest rate. It would be with principal, interest, no HOA, property taxes, and homeowners insurance, which does vary state to state, city to city. But the average payment, or the all-in payment, would be $2,523 at a 7% fixed rate. Whereas if you had a 3% amazing rate, it'd be $1,712. So obviously an $800 difference there. Huge, massive difference. And you've got to, obviously fix that into your budget, as also just realize that, things are less affordable than they were, 3.5 years ago, simply because of those interest rates. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind is that we have historically high housing prices right now. When you look at home prices in the U.S. and you compare it to the median household income, your entire household, you and your spouse, and then you just look at that median number, you're looking at the highest ratio at any point in history, and that includes right before the Great Recession, when we had the housing bubble of late 2004, 2005, 2006, and even 2007. So it's even more expensive than it was then. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that over the last 40 years, home prices have outpaced income growth pretty solidly. Income growth has gone up around 3.6 times, whereas housing, especially since 2020, has spiked. So it's up around 5.3 times. So keep that in mind when you're looking to buy, that we're at historically high prices. Oh, and then one more point on the historically high prices is that according to the Case-Shiller Index, and Robert Shiller's an economist at Yale, really smart guy, he's put together a housing index, and when he compares it to the inflation rate, we are adjusted for inflation at the highest level of home prices in all of U.S. history. And this chart only goes back 50 years, but it's the highest level of home prices adjusted for inflation at any time in U.S. history. And so when you're thinking about buying a home, you've really got to have eyes wide open that we're at extremely high home valuations, whether you look at it adjusted for inflation, whether you look at it adjusted for median income. Every metric says that we're at really high housing prices right now. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is construction. And this is actually really good news for buyers. It's good news for the economy. It's good news, honestly, for everyone. Construction is finally picking back up, and we're putting even more and more homes on the market. And I've got a few different charts to show you here. The first is the number of unsold completed homes is at its highest level since July 2009. And so right now, as of March 2025, there's 119,000 unsold completed homes, and that's the highest level since July 2009. So that's a really great news that people aren't buying, but the inventory is going on up. And so that's a good news for buyers because they don't want these homes to sit empty forever. So keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that the number of people working in residential building construction is also at the highest point that it's been really since around 2006 to 2007. We have 957,000 people in the U.S. working on building residential homes. So that's going to help bolster construction of new homes. And then finally, the share of new privately owned housing units that are getting started is finally bouncing back. And it's bouncing back from the post-Great Recession numbers. As you can imagine, after the Great Recession, home building basically stopped. Well, it didn't stop, but it went down dramatically to around really like 600,000 new housing starts per year. And we're back up to around 1.3 million new homes getting started every single year. And it's been that way since around 2020. And obviously post-COVID, when there's a little shutdown there. But that's really good news that we're building more homes with, more workers getting involved, and that's going to help increase the supply, which is going to have great news on the whole supply and demand metric. When we look to my next point, which is offered by Redfin, there are actually 500,000 more sellers in the U.S. than there are buyers. And if you look at 2020, 2021, 2022, and in the very early parts of 2023, you look at this chart in red, we have the buyers, in blue we have the sellers. Look at in 2020 to the end of 2022, look at how many more buyers there were than sellers. And that's why home prices went up so drastically, just because there was a supply and demand issue where there wasn't nearly as much supply as demand justified. And that's obviously going to push up prices, basic economics. But now the inverse is true. We've got more sellers, people that people that were not able, did not want to, whatever, sell during, the housing bubble that we had from 2020 to 2023 or so. Now they're looking to sell. Now they're, finally looking to relocate. Maybe they didn't want to part ways with their 3 to 4% interest rate on their mortgage, but now they realize, hey, interest rates aren't coming back down, and I really want to leave this house. I want to get out into something bigger, go to a different part of the country, whatever. Now they're just saying, okay, I got to sell, and then they're coming on the market. So the supply and demand equation for home buyers was not in your favor from 2020 to 2023. Now it's finally shifted, and it is in favor of the buyers. So you've got to keep that in mind. And then one silly tweet that I found was a tweet from some guy named Logan who said that there were 75 plus people waiting to see one home back in 2022. And I don't know the location of it, but he's got a picture of all of these people. Just absolutely insane how much demand there was. And there's so little supply that we had 75 people waiting to see one single home. Actually, a couple more data points that I want to share with you. First is that Americans, by and large, are not doing as well as on their finances as they were, say, 12 to 24 months ago. The percentage of Americans who are falling behind on their car payments, i.e. they're 60 days late or more, it's at the highest level that it's ever been on record. We've got just over 6.25% of people are 60 days late or more on their car payments. That's really not a great sign, higher than any point during the Great Recession as well, which is absolutely mind-boggling. Credit card delinquency is on the rise, and that's 90 days or more past due. The poorest 10% via income have seen a rise of their delinquency from around 13% all the way up to 20-ish%. Even the richest 10% per income have gone from maybe 4.5% delinquency all the way up to probably around 6 to 7% delinquency. And so not a huge jump, but man, that trend is really worrisome. And so that's really not a great trend for us to see. And then the last thing I'm going to point out about consumers is that the number of job openings is actually declining rapidly year year over year. And so I'm not necessarily saying we're going to see a recession, but the job market is not nearly as hot as it was in 2021, 2, and 3. And so if that trend continues, less job openings, less people able to move up and get a new job, increase their income, plus falling behind on debt payments. That's not great for consumers, which means it's going to make it harder for some people to buy homes, which is going to make it easier for some people with the ability to pay for a home. If there's more sellers, less buyers, that's going to even more put the odds in their favor to get a good home price when they want to buy. And then the last thing that I want to point out to all of you folks looking to buy a home is that you've got to be mindful of history. And so a lot of people my age, I am not a spring chicken anymore, unfortunately. I'm 39 years old. A lot of people my age and younger have really only known housing prices to go up, especially if you think about like if you're 22 or so when you got out of college in 2008, and then obviously that was a terrible time in housing prices, but you become an adult, young 20s, and let's say around 2010, pretty much since then, we've seen home price appreciations slowly and steadily, which is the way I like to see it, from 2010 until 2020. And then I really think we saw a housing bubble from 2020 all the way up until maybe the end of 2023 or 2024. But now I really don't think we're in that housing bubble. And I just want to, for my younger folks that are listening, I want to show you what can happen with home prices, even if you buy and hold it for multiple years, even a decade or more, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to make money. And a lot of people have this misimpression that real estate prices always go up. That's not always the case. If you buy at the wrong time, you can get hurt. So I've got a few different areas that we'll go through. The first one that's been up on your screen is Sierra Vista, Arizona. And these folks bought in November of 2006 for $453,000. And then 19 years later, they're listing for $489,000, a 7.7% increase. Obviously, that is a listing price that they are asking for. And so even if we assume they get every single dollar that they're asking for, that's still a quote unquote, only 7.7% increase on their value, not including all of the money that they've put into it. And I really don't know if they're going to get that full listing price. So they're basically going to be very, very, very lucky to break even, and they probably will lose money on this transaction even after owning a home for 19 years. San Diego, California, some folks bought a home in 1994 for $200,000. In 2003, right before the kind of housing mania, actually that was during the housing mania, they sold it for $455,000. And then those people who bought it in 2003, they sold it 11 years later. Amazing time to hold a home. That's great. I typically recommend at least holding a home for 5 to 7 years if you're going to buy. And they sold for $450,000. So they hold for 11 years and then they lose $5,000 on the transaction, not to mention all the costs that went into it. Now, obviously, if they were paying off their mortgage, that's a form of kind of fixed savings. So they built up equity, and that's great. And hopefully this won't devastate them financially. It probably won't. But the price didn't go up, even if they held it for 11 years, even in a great location like San Diego. Let's go down to, let's just do one more. Actually, we'll do two more. Thousand Oaks, California, absolutely beautiful, amazing place to live. Some folks bought a home in 2006 for $712,000, and then 4 years later, they sold it for $524,000, almost a $200,000 loss. That absolutely hurts. And then even the people that bought it in 2010, quote unquote, after the Great Recession was over, but home prices were still hurting at that point. So they bought in 2010 for $524,000, and then they sold 2 years later, which is way too short to be owning a home, but they sold 2 years later for $490,000. So they lost, what is that, $34,000 on that home in a 2-year period. And then obviously listing it, those people that bought in 2012, they listed it in 2025, and they're hoping to double their money. I'm not sure they're going to get the whole thing, but they definitely bought at a really low point, so they'll definitely make a profit. So that's great for those most recent folks, but look at those two other people. One lost $200,000, another lost $34,000, and again, that's in a really desirable neighborhood. So my point is, you just can't be guaranteed that you're going to make money on a real estate transaction. A lot of people think numbers always go up with the real estate. Not true. You can buy at a bad time and lose some money. And losing $200,000, that's really, really tough. And then the last one we'll go through is Florida. And let's see here. Some folks bought in 2023, which is right in the middle of the housing COVID bubble. In my estimation, they bought for $629. Then 2 years later, which is again, absurdly short time to own and then sell a home. They wanted to list it for $745, no buyers. Then they wanted to list it for $709, no buyers. Then they moved it down to $699, no buyers. Then they moved it down to $689, no buyers. Then they finally made a bigger increase down to $645, and that was of May 23rd of 2025, this year, obviously. And so I'll tell you exactly what's going on with this home. They bought it for $630, and they're just hoping and praying that they can break even on this transaction. And at first, they probably thought, hey, we're still in a housing bubble. We're going to make some money. We're going to make $100,000. How easy is this just to buy a home, watch the numbers go up by six figures in a couple years, sell, and then rake in all that cash? Well, that's not the way it goes all the time. That's what happens in a mania. That's what happens in a bubble, but that's not what happens all the time. And so now they've adjusted their expectations from making six figures to please, 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 Mr. Market, just let us break even. But I don't know if they will. We might have some more pain in store for them. So let's see. Okay, so that's the last of the points that I wanted to make on housing history and what could happen. And then just some last words of advice before we wrap it up. As far as I can see, sellers are acting like we still have 3% interest rates, but we don't. They're acting like we're still in a housing bubble, but we're not. We're not in a bubble anymore. Construction of new homes is rising. The housing supply is rising rapidly. Consumers' finances are going in the wrong direction. In addition to those interest rates, because of those interest rates, investors are going to have less interest in buying a home, because we saw what happened with the $416,000 home at 3% interest rates. That payment's $1,700 a month. At 7% interest rates, that's $2,500 a month. That $800 difference is a big deal for the investors, because if they're going to buy it and then try and rent it out, that's an $800 extra gap that they're going to have to try and figure out how to make that profitable. And guess what? It's a lot tougher to make a housing rental profitable at 7% interest rates than it is at 3% interest rates. So if you're a first-time home buyer, you're going to have less competition from investors, because they're not going to be able to see how they can make a profit at 7% interest rates. And so they're just not going to participate in buying at these levels at those interest rates. All this to say, if you're interested in buying a home in the next few years, here's my advice. You got to save up as much cash as humanly possible. 20% down is still a fantastic goal to have. Plus, you have to have an emergency fund in addition to that. You also have to understand that if things get worse in the economy, but you personally are still doing okay at your job, that's going to put you in a more advantageous position. Another point that I have is that you cannot fall in love with any house that you see. There's always going to be another one. So you can't get into this bidding war in your head where you're not being a skeptical, picky investor. As inventory by sellers continues to increase, your pickiness needs to increase. Your realtor might hate this, and the home seller will absolutely hate this. But if you're looking to buy a home in the next couple of years, and things going wrong, and in the wrong trend in the U.S. economy and in your individual location, I would seriously consider making some offensive, disrespectful offers on homes. And if the seller says F you to you, that's fine, because again, there's always going to be another home. And I really don't see a reason why, as a first-time home buyer, you need to get into the market at the very top of the housing housing market that we're at right now. So be patient, hoard up as much cash as possible, be picky, and don't be afraid to offer far under whatever that initial listing price is. That's all I've got for today's episode. I hope it was helpful, and I will see you next time. Bye.